A/B testing, multivariate testing, usability testing, incrementality testing. At some point, don't we stop improving from all of this testing? Or instead, should we be pursuing Kaizen-style optimization? Marketing and sales are full of myths, misconceptions, and sometimes flat-out lies. Join us as we get out of the echo chamber and talk about testing and learning.
Hello, and welcome to the Rethink Marketing Podcast, where we push back on generalized marketing advice. I'm Paul Frodge, joined by Mr. Marketing, and for today's conversation, the ostentatious oligarch of ongoing optimization, Colin Jeffries. Colin, how are you today?
Paul, I feel about as good as a marketing intern who actually understands their job responsibilities. How are you?
I'm doing well. Let's dive into what we're rethinking today. Marketers are constantly testing and optimizing, but to what end? Is it possible to ever reach perfection? How do we make sure we are intelligent and intentional about our tests? So let's jump right in, Colin.
That sounds great, Paul. So like you said, we're constantly, as marketing leaders, testing to pursue optimization. I was having a conversation with a marketing leader of a regional home services company, and he was bragging a little bit that their customer acquisition cost was about 75% of target, meaning that if their target was $100, he was only spending $75, and that their average revenue ticket size was 100% of projection, meaning that they're spending less to get a new customer, and that new customer is spending more than they had budgeted. So I kind of look at that and I think, is testing necessary? Is the risk of losing that level of success by over testing or over optimizing or losing some of his target segment, is that worth the incremental improvement if he could go from 75% of target to 73.5% of target, right? He's already beating projections. He's already beating targets on both customer acquisition side and the revenue side. Is testing necessary? Then I think about the opposite scenario on the other side of the spectrum, which would be if somebody's coming in at 200% of target customer acquisition cost, or maybe they're coming in at 70% of revenue projection. Well, in those instances, instead of just testing everything and blanket testing, we should be instead looking at where do I think there are fail points and how can I get into those fail points and optimize and fix them? The lowest hanging fruit here typically are things like email subject line testing, call to action testing. If we're using paid ads and driving folks to landing pages, we can change how the landing pages are laid out, etc. But ultimately, I think before we dive into the conversation about are we testing too much, we really have to understand what's the goal. Is it a one-off optimization where we're trying to build the perfect landing page and there's an end in sight? Or is it this Kaizen style continuous improvement where we're just optimizing for the sake of optimizing for perpetuity?
All right. So I look at your example that you just gave about the testing for the company that you were talking about. And the one thing I think about is perfection. And that's how we started this episode. And what does perfection actually mean? You know, with that company, are they satisfied with where they're at in terms of revenue and their KPIs? Or is there room for improvement? What's to say that that 73 or 75% that you mentioned is ideal or something that cannot be improved? So I look at that company and say, is that perfect? I don't think anything's ever perfect. Everything is always striving to get better. So I would challenge us as marketers and us as business professionals about what perfection actually looks like, or what does close to perfection look like. And I agree with you. If that is close to perfection or they don't want to improve anymore, then stop testing.
Well, I'll push back on that a little bit and say that perfection it's very amorphous and it's very hard to pin down, but profitability should be pretty easy for business leaders to pin down. So if I can drive a new customer for $150 and the profit margin on that customer is, well, let's say 25%, 30%, 40%, at that level, if I can drive more customers for $95 or $75, phenomenal. But if I'm giving up customers that would cost me $170, $180, maybe $200, and there's still profit to be made in those customers, then perhaps I should actually be less efficient and continue to drive more volume because there's still profit there, even though it's the opposite direction of perfection. It's not necessarily a bad thing because we're still driving profit. Now, in most SMB situations, we want to continue to get more efficient with our spend. We want a better return on ad spend and those types of things. But I've seen folks that over test and they actually lose out on profitable customers because they're continuing to squeeze the budget and continuing to pursue a level of efficiency that just doesn't make sense because they're giving up profitable customers. Have you seen that, Paul?
I have, and sometimes too much time, I agree with you, is spent on testing and not looking at other things within business and the opportunity to improve in other areas. And, for us as an agency, for example, our clients are looking at us to steer the ship and to give them the recommendation on what does testing look like, the A/B test, the optimizing, to what end, like we talked about. And yeah, it's a trial and error in some situations. A lot of things are customized. A lot of things are new markets. A lot of things are trying new things to see what is going to really move the needle. And sometimes you need to figure it out as you are flying the plane when it comes to testing to see, okay, enough is enough, or we need to do more. And what is driving the most results in terms of looking at conversions, for example, and seeing, okay, these areas of marketing are driving more revenue, more profit for the company, or more, form fills on a website, more phone calls, and then looking at the other end and seeing, okay, this area of marketing is needing some more improvement. This one's working good. This one needs some more help, and diverting some of the attention to there. So a lot of times it is trial and error. Marketing, as we know, is not an exact science, and it continues to evolve over time. And, us as marketing professionals really diving in and helping our clients when it comes to looking at this trial and error and testing really is something that's ever evolving.
I think you put that really well. The intentionality behind what we're testing, why we're testing, what the goals are, those sorts of things matter tremendously because otherwise we can find ourselves in this continuous loop of testing and testing and testing and testing. And if that's not necessarily bad if we know why we're testing and what we're testing and then how we are implementing those learnings going forward. Where I've seen teams get distracted and test for the sake of testing is in a platform like Google Ads, where there are an infinite number essentially of headline copy, of body copy, of calls to action, those types of things. And when they're running 50, 60, 70, 100 plus campaigns, and you have 5 to 10 ads in each campaign, there are thousands potentially of different ads. And you can go in and have, again, different headline copy, different body copy, et cetera, different calls to action. So I think we have to step back for a moment and say, to your point, with some intentionality, what's the opportunity cost here? If I have a full-time person spending their job optimizing Google Ads, what else could they be doing? Could they be creating video content? Could they be optimizing our meta ads? Could they be optimizing our emails, et cetera? Right? There are a lot of things that they could be spending their time on. The second thing is, what are we doing with current learnings? Chances are we know our call center process could improve, our email form fill process could improve, our fill in the blank could improve. What are we doing to actually tackle that low hanging fruit instead of driving our click through rate on Google Ads from 0.025% to 0.026%? And then the third thing is, how are we looking at global trends or trends within our customer base so that way we're not myopic and focused on we're increasing our click-through rate on our Google Ads by 0.001%. Well, yes, but then we're missing out on the fact that the market is actually shifting away from our product and into something new. So I think if we consider those three things, then we can be a lot more intentional about why we're testing, what we're testing, and then again, how we go about learning, because testing and collecting data for the sake of testing and collecting data, but not actually acting on the back end, frankly, is a waste of resources.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And you mentioned Google Ads and the opportunities there for somebody that's managing that. I would much rather somebody focus on Google Ads, focusing on a previous episode that we had on continuous improvement and looking at opportunities to bring to clients that might not just be testing after test after test, but get it to a point to where everybody's comfortable and it's driving results, and then figure out, what continuous improvement, what opportunities there are for that as well. So I totally agree with that. And looking at perfection, for instance. I look at when we did employee evaluations, hopefully everybody does employee evaluations maybe once a year or maybe even more often than that. And looking at, I know the one that we have is looking at, somebody that is needing improvement, somebody that's successful, somebody that excels, and those that are really honest with themselves. And I do this as well when I'm doing an evaluation. If for my supervisors in the past in my career, is I never checked Excels. I looked at that as almost like perfection, and I was always challenging myself with being successful or needs improvement. It will always toggle between those two categories, and I look at that in this conversation as well. Is everybody is striving for improvement. Everybody can be successful, but then what's next? So I was thinking about this episode in preparation, and I was liking it to an employee evaluation.
I think that's exactly right, because we do take time during employee evaluations or as supervisors reviewing folks. And then when we are, like you said, kind of managing up to our own supervisor, we take some time to reflect and we think about what are we doing well? Where can we improve? What's realistic improvement, right? If you have a marketing coordinator come in and you're bashing them because they're really bad at asking for 30-day terms on contracts that they're bringing in or what have you, right? Well, that's on you for not training them correctly. And I think that there's an element there too, where as campaign optimizers and strategy optimizers, we have to take a step back and reflect and think, what's realistic? What makes sense? What are the overall business objectives? And then how do I make sure I'm not being either overly optimistic or overly pessimistic? The other thing I'll kind of add to that is, this ties into employee evaluations as well, but at some point we have to ask ourselves, is the juice worth the squeeze? Where we have some employees and for the 2 years they're underperforming in every category. Well, how much management, how much mentorship, how much handholding can we do with that person? Or is it time to just part ways and hire somebody that's maybe a better fit or works harder or whatever the situation is? The same exact thing is true for testing and optimizing from a marketing perspective. I could spend hours and hours and hours writing email subject lines for a variety of emails that I'm sending out. But if my subscriber list is 200 people and I'm chunking that into 10 sections of 20, and I'm spending time writing 10 email subject lines for each group and picking the best one and testing it, is all of that effort worth it? I heard a story about a gentleman, and I forget what his name was, but this was in the late 1800s, and he was a very talented artist. And so he went into a store to buy some food, and he handed the cashier $20. And she took the $20 bill and she put it in the register. And then she noticed that her fingers had paint on them. And she thought, that's really odd. So she went to the police and she said, hey, I think I was handed a recently painted counterfeit $20 bill. And so the police started to investigate, and they went to this gentleman's house and they, went through it. And what they found is that he had painting equipment in his attic, and he was painting very meticulously. He was a very skilled painter. He was painting $20 bills. Well, he also painted several canvases. So they raided his house. They set his paintings up to auction, and they sold off. And we have to keep in mind, this is late 1800s. So $20 was a substantial sum of money. They auctioned off several of his paintings for tens of thousands of dollars. And it took him about as long to paint a $20 bill as it did for him to paint a canvas that would sell for tens of thousands of dollars. So I say all that to say, as marketers, when we're considering, I can keep squeezing this fruit, but am I getting any juice out of it? Are we spending so much time painting our $20 bills and not painting our canvases that are going to be exponentially more valuable?
That's a great story. I totally agree with with your points there, and looking at the opportunities for the continuous improvement as well. And this is definitely an interesting topic with looking at anything in life, anything in business, anything in your personal life, and trying to figure out, what do I need to focus on next, and when do I need to stop doing this? I think with any company, if you give them a certain role within the company, they can certainly fill a 40-hour week, right? And
Absolutely.
if that is just writing subject lines for 40 hours a week, somebody could do that. But does it make sense for the company or the organization to continue to do that, or to look at other areas? You talk about, Colin, looking at with certain people in the organization, and if you need to make a switch for somebody, a lot of times what we're looking at, even in our own company, is there might be a skill set that we uncover that one of our team members has, and they might have a passion and an interest in something else. And some of it might be testing, some of it might be something else within the organization. But instead of thinking about they don't make sense for our team, let's look at opportunities where maybe they do have an interest in testing some things and, coming back with feedback to the team and contributing even more, maybe in a different role or a different seat within the organization. So certainly something to consider for those marketers out there.
That's a great point too, that this is not just about advertising campaigns. There can be a lot of testing done within the scope of job crafting as well. So excellent point, Paul. Well, Paul, this has been a fun conversation. I don't know that we solved the problem of finding the perfect balance of testing versus executing against what we've learned, but we did talk about applying learnings, about profitability, about trying to find perfection, about defining goals, lots and lots of things within this conversation. Again, one that I feel like I'm having more frequently with marketers as it feels like teams are getting a little bit leaner. And when the teams are leaner, people have to be a little more focused on, I hate to say actual production, but really that's what it is. They're more focused on actual production versus testing and learning. So an interesting time for sure. Anything else you would add before we end this episode?
I would say, is the juice worth the squeeze? Certainly in margaritas.
Well said. Well said. Well, I'm glad you weren't too salty during this episode, Paul.
Right. There you go.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today on the Rethink Marketing Podcast. Until next week, keep rethinking those common assumptions and keep rethinking the value of testing. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If people want to connect with us, where should they go, Paul?
RethinkMarketingPodcast.com, Colin. What can listeners do to help us in return for the sage marketing wisdom and our pithy humor?
They can help us by leaving a review on their favorite platform or sharing this episode with a fellow marketer to help them cut through the clutter.
Well, until next time, keep rethinking those common assumptions.